So with the WoW Classic Anniversary Fresh servers coming out on November 21st, I want to do a quick guide on every single class in the game, essentially talking about more the PvE side. I'm not going to delve into PvP due to the video would be way too long. I want to focus on how they do with their leveling speed, what kind of specs they have, can they tank, can they heal, can they DPS, what it kind of looks like in endgame, and what they really excel at. So let's not waste any more time and let's jump into it. So I guess we start out right away with the Warrior. Now the Warrior is essentially the 0 to hero class of Classic, the slowest leveling classes in the game. But at endgame, they are complete monsters. They are the top DPS as a Fury Warrior, and they're also the best class for tanking. So essentially you have a class that is really weak in the beginning, but you put a lot of time into it, you level the class, finally get to endgame, and you get geared up, and it will be rewarding. Now, the great thing with the Anniversary servers coming out is that they're going to have dual spec, so not only can you level as a regular DPS warrior, you also can get the tank spec. Now, I highly recommend if you're going to be leveling a warrior to go tank spec, and the reason why is because it's going to be way easier to get into dungeons. In Classic back in 2019, it was difficult to find tanks and healers. Is this how it is? Everyone wants to play a DPS. So if you can be a really valuable tank, it's going to be very easy to get into groups. So I highly recommend playing the Warrior if you enjoy melee type classes. That will be great long term. Don't expect it to be really great in the early game. You will be quite weak. But if you put a lot of time commitment, it will be really great in the end game when you're the best tank or the best DPS, because they're the monsters of vanilla WoW. The next class we'll talk about is the Paladin. They are Alliance exclusive, so if you want to play a Paladin, you can't play Horde. Keep that in mind. Now, with Paladins, they are a hybrid class of melee and also being able to cast abilities, and they have a mana bar. Now, with Paladins, I will say outright, they are one of the most boring leveling classes in the game. I know it's a little subjective, but they're extremely boring. It's casting a seal and then auto-attacking the enemy to death. It is like that forever, over and over, just auto-attacking enemies. Now, if you want to listen to a podcast or watch a show while you play a Paladin, it's not so bad. That's how I did it, but Paladins are very boring levelers. It's just how it is. They're just literally auto-attack simulators. Start off with the worst thing about Paladin, but let's talk about the best thing about them. They are hands down the most valuable class you can have in your party. The buffs they give are insane. They are a must-have for any endgame raid, whether it's a raid group of serious players, no-life players, or just casual players. They're all going to want Paladins in your group because Paladins are the best class for buffs. They also are one of the best healers in the game. Their best buffs are Blessing of the Kings, Blessing of Wisdom, Blessing of Salvations, all different buffs that increase the damage or health or HP, attribute stats of characters in your group, which are just going to be really beneficial for your parties to take down dungeons and raid bosses quicker. Now, I will say, if you're going to play Paladin, you have to keep in mind that their DPS spec called Retribution is a meme spec. It's really terrible in Classic WoW, and unfortunately it doesn't get decent until TBC, and then extremely good in Wrath of the Lich King. So if you're going to play Classic WoW Paladin, you're not going to be able to really play a DPS spec unless you have a really forgiving guild, and you're just going to be kind of messing around because your damage is just non-existent. Unfortunately, in Classic WoW, balancing is not really the best of the best. Some classes are just terrible with their specs, and Retribution Paladin is just one of them. So if you're going to play Paladin in the end game and you're going to join dungeons and raids, people are going to expect you to be Holy Paladin, which is a healing spec. Now, I just want to put that out there because some people don't like healing in MMORPGs. So if you're going to play Paladin, people are going to expect you to play their best spec, which is a healer and / buff class. So if you don't want to heal, you probably don't want to pick Paladin. Next up is the Rogue, and this is my favorite class to play. I will have to say, this is a subjective opinion, but they are one of the best leveling classes to play because they're so extremely fun. The main reason is because they have an energy system to cast abilities, which is constantly regenerating, so your downtime in between fights is pretty quick. You're not like a ranged class where you have to sit down and regain your mana and HP. You can kind of keep going with rogues a lot, just keep attacking mobs over and over. And Classic is a slower paced game, so being able to constantly be in combat and cast abilities is just really fun. Now, with rogues, they are a stealth based class, so what you can do is go into stealth and hide from enemies. Now, this is kind of a game changer for PvP servers if you're planning to roll on it, because you can kind of hide from enemy faction players. I can't tell you how many times I've survived when a group of 2 to 3 Horde players are rolling by and I'm on Alliance, and I can stealth and kind of go around them without having to fight them and get steamrolled over by them. And it's really nice having that stealth. If you're playing on PvE, is not as important. On a PvP server where the enemy faction can attack you, being able to go into stealth is just so helpful from avoiding those type of fights where you don't want to fight, a 1v2 or something like that. Now with Rogue at endgame, in terms of pure DPS, they are the second strongest melee DPS class. And on different fights, they are actually like in second place. If endgame Fury Warrior spec is like an S tier DPS class, then Rogue would be like A tier. So you're going to be very powerful in endgame raids and content. The only downside with Rogue is that number one, everyone's going to be playing it. It's a very popular class. And when you're trying to do raids and dungeons, it can be kind of hard to get into groups because rogues don't really offer any type of buffs or benefits like a Paladin does. You can't heal on them, you can't take on them unless you're playing Season Discovery. So really with Rogue, the only benefit you kind of bring is just your DPS. And it can be difficult to get into some of those endgame raids and dungeon groups as a rogue where you're not bringing any type of utility. This is something I struggled with back in 2019. If I had to do all over again, what I highly recommend is making a lot of friends along the way. I know it's kind of cliche, but as a rogue, you really want to be making friends. You want to be doing dungeons and groups with people early on, building that friendship, leveling with them. So when it gets to the level 60 endgame and you need to get into a raid spot, you're like, hey, remember friend, remember me? I'm that rogue player. They might invite you. So just keep that in mind. Next up is the priest class. Now, they are the main go-to class in the game for healing. So if you're someone who really enjoys playing a healing class, this is your go-to class. This is what they're dedicated to do. They actually have a surprisingly pretty quick leveling speed because all you need is a pretty decent wand, and then they have an ability that boosts the damage that you use from wands, and you can simply cast a shadow dot onto the enemy and then just wand them down over and over. And it actually does pretty good DPS. I leveled a hardcore priest doing this, and it's quicker than you would expect. So if you're looking for a class that is, not the top leveling class, but can go at a pretty good speed, and then also is always one in groups because they're the healing class that, again, kind of like tanks, they're hard to find. Like most people are not going to be playing a healing class. So if you're a decent healer, you will get welcomed into dungeons and groups way faster than any DPS would. Really the only downside I can say about them is that you will be having to drink a lot. You'll have to drink water to regain mana during pulls, and you really have no way to regain mana without using consumables. You're not like a Warlock who can be self-sufficient, or a Mage that can create water out of thin air. With priests, you're going to have to buy it and actually use them. So that's really the only downside, and in between pulls, you'll have to obviously sit there and regain your mana. Now, as I said, in leveling, it's pretty easy because you're just wanding down the enemy. You can actually be more uptime than you would as like in a dungeon where you have to drink a lot because you're using healing spells. They do have a shadow spec, which is actually pretty decent in PvP, but I don't know if you guys ever had that student in your classroom who was the teacher's favorite. That's what the Mage is to Blizzard. They're the teacher's favorite class. They're the company's favorite class. Mage can do everything. They're extremely gifted. There really isn't anything I can say downside for them. So not only can they AoE farm, essentially they can pull a bunch of mobs and AoE them all down with Blizzard, being the fastest leveler in the game with that method if you're doing AoE farming. They also can create their own food and water so they can always regain their health and mana without having to spend any gold or copper or silver or anything like that. They can make it out of thin air. They also can create portals, and so they can go to different cities. So like if you're out questing and you want to go back to your capital city, you can cast a Stormwind portal and instantly teleport to the city without having to use any type of traveling method. Extremely efficient. They're also gold making machines. They're the easiest gold making machine class in the game. Very easy to make gold because not only can you just chill in a capital city and sell ports to other classes that want to go to different capital cities, you can make gold just literally chilling. You also can AoE farm, which generates a lot of gold. You can sell boosts. You can level other characters in dungeons by doing AoE farms, and then they pay you to level them in the dungeon. They're just a gold-making machine. Really, my recommendation is leveling a Mage if you want to have an easy life in Classic. It's just how it is with them. And I really recommend them if you're planning to level like ult characters. Like, let's say you're planning to level a Mage and a Warrior. Level the Mage first. Please, don't level the Warrior first. Because if you level the Mage first, you're going to have a ton of gold, ton of consumables that you can transfer over to your Warrior by mailing it to them to make them level way faster. So basically your Mage will be your main money maker, and you can make your Warrior's life way easier when they level up. So if you want to like have an old character that's harder to level like a Warrior, the Mage is the best class to main because it's just going to make your life way easier when you start leveling the Warrior. Really thinking about it, the only downside about this class is they're a little boring at endgame. You're basically spamming Frostbolt. Not to say that like classic rotations are really complex. Most classes are like 1 or 2 abilities at endgame. But with Mage, you're literally just casting Frostbolt over and over and over and over. So it can be a little bit boring. I guess that could be the only downside, but they're such a gifted class and they really have everything going for them. In terms of endgame DPS, they're kind of in that A tier with Rogue, so they're not like the top DPS S tier like Fury Warriors, but again, they're very strong DPS classes. Next up, we have the Warlock, and the Warlock is a ranged DPS class that specializes in using pets, aka minions. Essentially how it works is that you can cast different demons like Imp, which casts firebolts and help you kill enemies. They also have a dedicated tank type minion called the Voidwalker, which can actually pull aggro from mobs and let the mobs attack the Voidwalker while you cast abilities in the back. So they're very quick levelers because you really don't have to take any damage. And while you're leveling, most people go drain life type Fletching build, which basically means that you're gaining health from enemies while you're attacking them and you're casting dots onto them. So it's very hard to die on a Warlock while you're leveling. They also are self-sufficient because they have an ability called Life Tap, which takes away a little bit of your HP to give you more mana. So if you're running low on mana, you don't have to sit down and drink water. You can sacrifice a little bit of your HP and gain that mana back to cast more abilities over time. On top of that, they also have a lot of utility. They have an ability called Ritual of Summoning, which allows you to summon any player in your party to your location. So this is really great when you're running dungeons and you're trying to get a group. There's a lot of people that will be in the capital city, which is way over here, and the dungeon entrance is way over here. So what you can do is summon them instantly to you. When you make a portal and allow your enemies to touch the portal, they'll instantly teleport to you. This is so valuable because it takes so long to travel on the flight paths in Classic WoW. It could take like 20 plus minutes to get to a dungeon. It's insanely long, and you're just sitting there waiting for your party member to get to the dungeon entrance. It's pretty miserable. It's really, really boring. So having a Warlock that can instantly summon your party member to you to the dungeon is so valuable. It's also a different utility like Health Stones, which you can trade with other players, which is basically like an HP pot. It instantly gives you HP when you click it. They also have a Soul Stone, so when you take fatal damage and die, you don't have to revive yourself. It instantly gives you back around a quarter of your HP, so you don't have to go back to the graveyard and run back to your body. Now, in the Classic WoW Anniversary servers, they're going to be removing the debuff limit on bosses. If you didn't know, in original Classic WoW, you can only put so many debuffs in a raid on a boss, which meant you really couldn't put too many, because if you have multiple Warlocks in a party, in a raid, the debuff limit would be like over the top already very quickly. They're removing that debuff limit on these Anniversary servers, so this is a dedicated change. And so some people have mentioned that you might have a little bit of a different rotation or a DPS increase. One thing we noticed in Season of Mastery is they did have the same change, and it still was a DPS loss if you weren't spamming Shadow Bolt over and over. So we'll kind of see how it goes. Maybe some things will change and you'll get a little bit of a DPS increase as a Warlock. It's definitely not a nerf or anything for them to do this change, but overall you'll probably still be spamming Shadow Bolt over and over. Next up, we got the Hunter. Now, the Hunter is the fastest leveling class in the game, excluding AoE mages. If you're not AoE farming on a mage over and over against mobs, the Hunter is the #1 leveling class. They are extremely quick at leveling, mainly because of their pets that they can capture and use to fight other enemy mobs with you. Similar to the Warlock, they have a pet type system, but with Hunters, you can actually cast a wider variety of pets to use, and each of them have different skills and abilities, and you can level them up. One factor you have to keep in mind is you have to constantly feed them. This is a system that got removed later on in WoW, but in Classic you will have to maintain them and give them food to keep them fighting for you. Hunters also have to maintain their ammo. This is something you have to do for inventory management. If you run out of bullets or arrows, as Hunters can use bows or guns, if you run out of that ammo, you no longer can use your main way to do DPS. So there's something kind of like Hunters, you do have to resource management, which is something you have to keep in mind. But they're such an easy class to play, and they're so quick at leveling. If you're really a new player, I do recommend the Hunter because they're such easy mode. They're so quick to level, very, very safe with your pet, being able to tank a lot of damage, and they're just very quick with the range because you're standing in the back shooting arrows and bullets at enemies. You don't even have to really get up close and personal. They can do melee DPS, but it's not really that great. Your main source of damage is being a ranged class, so if you don't like ranged classes, keep that in mind with the hunter. The really downside of hunters is they don't scale the best, so I would say their DPS and endgame is kind of more in the B tier. They're not as strong as rogues, mages, and warlocks. They're more in that B tier where they kind of fall off in the very late game, where they don't scale as credible as like a Fury Warrior where you're a god tier DPS. And so that's something to keep in mind. You will not be topping the damage meter compared to some of these other classes, but you still are a very valuable class to raids, and you do a lot of ranged DPS. You have a lot of unique abilities like Feign Death, which allows you to play dead. They do bring some utility raid, as some pets do buff damage of your party members, but it's not really a big benefit for the class in terms of their like the utility class that people want to bring. I would say they're brought mainly because they just do solid range DPS. Mainly I would play Hunter if you want a class that is very easy in the early game, very strong, and a very fast leveler. Next up we got the Shaman. Now keep in mind this class is kind of like Paladin, where this is the Horde exclusive class and this is the healer dedicated class. So in endgame raids and dungeons, you will be kind of looked at to be more of a healer. Their versions of buffs are totems that they place down on the floor, and they give various different buffs to the party that really help complete raids and dungeons faster. Now in early game, it's recommended to go more like enchantment, where you're buffing your weapon and just doing a lot of auto tats and shock abilities. And like the Paladin, this class is a must-have for the Horde side. They are so strong in groups. They are amazing healers. They do so much healing. They also have an ability called Reincarnation, so if you die, you can instantly revive yourself. Also have the best buffs in the game for the Horde side. One of the most iconic buffs in the game called the Wind Fury buff, which allows you to deal extra prots of attacks on your hits for your whole entire raid group, which is so great for DPS increasing. Just overall, this class is the juggernaut for healing and buffs. Now the last class we are talking about is the Druid. Now the Druid I kind of call the jack of all trades but master of none. Essentially they can heal, they can tank, and they can DPS, but they're not the top in any of those. So if you're okay with not being the best of the best in one of those fields, the Druid is actually extremely fun because you get all those playstyles in one, and their bear tanking form is actually pretty good. Like, it's not bad for dungeons at all. And so if you want a class that has a lot of variety where you can play any role, the Druid is a lot of fun. In endgame content, you're kind of dedicated more as a resto Druid healer class. Now you can go, endgame dungeons as a tank bear spec, but you're not going to be as good as a tank warrior, so you might not be picked as much for party groups. But overall, with how limited the tank class people there are in the game, I've gone in many dungeons where I'm just like, he's a tank bear, who cares, let's go, and it works out perfectly fine. They do have some aggro issues when you're having more than like 3+ mobs. It can be a little difficult to gain aggro on all of them, but it's not the end of the world, and it does work out for most dungeon groups. Now, kind of like Shaman's Ghost Wolf form, they have a speed form increase as Cat form. The only downside with this is you have to dedicate 2 talent points to increase the movement speed to 30%, where Ghost Wolf you just learn at level 20 and you don't have to put any talents into it. So it's kind of a worse version of Ghost Wolf, but it is an increase in your speed, which is pretty valuable again when you don't have a mount. Overall, I recommend Druid if you want to be that class where you kind of have a variety of play styles, and it actually is pretty nice to kind of learn how to play every single one. You can kind of learn how to stand back and be more of a healer. You can learn how to tank and interact with your groups, and you can also DPS as Cat form, which is not the top DPS in the world, but it's more of like a C tier, maybe even D tier depending on the player, but you can do some decent DPS in groups. Well, that kind of wraps up the video. It was a long video, and hopefully this gave you guys some insights on how the classes work. The main thing I wanted to double down on is just how they work in the leveling, how good they are, and what you're going to expect in the end game, because a lot of people play these classes early on, and then when they get to the end game dungeons and raids, they're like, what? I have to go healer? Like, I don't want to play a healer. And I want to make that really realistic, because in some groups you can be more of a meme spec, but when you're just running PUDs, it can be difficult to get into them. So I just want to make that kind of clear, and hopefully this guide helped you on the basis of these classes. I will make more guides like this in the future. Appreciate you guys watching all the way through if you did. I'll see you guys in the next one real soon.